Okay, we should be recording. We're going to take a look at a nice little program demonstrates looping. This is from your book. And so let's take a look at it line by line, see what's going on. Lines 1 and 2, we have a couple of lines of comment. I'll just read it. This program averages test scores. It asks the user for the number of students and the number of test scores per student. Actually, it might be a little more beneficial if we actually run this first to see how it looks. Let's do that. All right, we'll give it a second. There it is down towards the bottom here. How many students do you have? Let's keep this simple. Let's say 3. How many test scores per student? 2, we'll say. All right, and notice it says now, it's prompting, it's telling us student number 1, okay, we're on the first student. Test number 1, it's waiting for a score. Let's enter 60. Test number 2, let's enter 70. Okay, and notice it went ahead and calculated. It says the average for student number 1 is 65. Now we're on student number 2. It's waiting for the score for test number 1. Let's enter 70. Test number 2, let's enter 80. Keep the calculation simple. And notice it went ahead and calculated the average for student number 2 is 75. Now it's displaying student number 3. It's waiting for the test score for test number 1. Let's go ahead and enter 90. And we'll enter 95 for this one. And it went ahead and calculated the average for student number 3 is 92.5. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the code. We saw the output. Let's see what the code for this is. All right, line number 1 again and 2, comments. We know what it's going to do. Line number 4, get the number of students. And so, as you can take a look here, we have nested functions. When you have a function inside of a function, like the input function is nested within this int function, always look to the innermost function first. And it says, how many students do you have? The user would enter a value like I did, which was 3. And then what the int function does, it's going to, internally, it's going to make sure that it's stored as an integer. Remember, an integer is like whole numbers, like 0, like 100, like negative 54, and so on and so on. But obviously, negative numbers wouldn't be relevant here. But then once it's stored internally as an integer, converted internally, we're going to, not stored, converted, then we're going to store it with the assignment operator. We're going to assign that value, 3, as an integer to a variable called num students, num underscore students. Okay? All right, line 7, we have another comment. Get the number of test scores per student. Okay, now remember, this is the assignment operator right here. And as I've mentioned before, when you see this guy, always look to the right. What do we have again? We have nested functions again. And we're going to look to the innermost nested function, which is the input function. How many test scores per student? And in that example, I entered 2. And so we're going to take that value 2 pass it on to the int function, which is going to convert that, if it wasn't already, into an integer. Now remember, the input function, like I said, if it wasn't already, it's always going to return a string. And so that's why it's necessary to convert it to an integer, okay? So it returns the string value that we would have entered 2, and then it converts it to an integer, and then it's stored in a variable called num test scores, okay? And so now we look at line number 10, it's a comment, determine each student's average test score. Now we're going to use a looping structure called the for loop. So here's what happens here. The first thing this for loop does is it creates a variable called student, and it's going to be initialized to the value 0. And then you're going to look and see, we're going to use the range function, and we're passing it the number of students. And in our example, we entered 3. So what this is going to do is first, it's going to look at the value 0 and see if that's less than 3, which it is. So then the condition, now all of this is abstracted away from you. You don't actually see it do this, but it's like all loops, they have to behave internally this way. And so since that condition is true, then it can drop into the body of the loop. And remember, in Python, the way you determine the body is by indentation. So all of this, if you see where my mouse is, all of it, let's just follow this line all the way around, all the way down. I might need to scroll a little bit so we can see. Actually, let's close this output window and we can see better, okay? So again, all of this belongs, follow my mouse along, and that little line you see to help you keep guide, all of that actually belongs to the body of this outer for loop here, okay? And so since that condition of the loop, in other words, that the first value of student would be 0, since that's less than the number of students, we drop into the loop. And so what's the next thing we do? Well, on line 12, there's a comment, and it just simply says initialize an accumulator for test scores. So then we're going to take the floating point value 0.0 here. We're going to assign that to total. So total starts off obviously with nothing. And then line 14, we see another comment, get the student's test score. And line 15, we have the print function, student number. Now remember, student here starts off the variable with the value 0. So that's the reason it says student plus 1. So 0 plus 1 is going to be 1. And so that's why it's going to say student number 1, okay, for the first time. Then it prints some of these dashes, just, you know, to separate, just for to help the user separate different parts. Then we encounter another looping structure. Okay, so this is a nested looping structure. All right, we have to start with this for test num. So test num would be 0 to start with, in the range, and then number of test scores. Well, remember in our little example, I entered 2 for the number of test scores. And so then in the body of the for loop, we have print, the print function, test number, and remember, test num is 0. If you add 1 to it, now it equals 1. So it's going to say test number 1, okay? Test number 1. And remember this little guy here, the default behavior of the print function is to add a new line character. And so when you say end equal, basically this is like a string that has nothing in it. So there's no space. And that overrides the dropping down to the new line. So The next line, line 19, we take a look to the right of the assignment operator and notice you have the input function. And the only thing the user would see from that is the little colon character, and we're waiting for a score to be input. So we entered the score. Then this value from the string, like for example, I believe the first one I entered was 60. It would be turned over, remember it's a string, um, turned over to the float function. It converts that value from the value, the string value 60 to the floating point equivalent of that. Then we're going to store that in the score variable. Okay, line 20, we encounter a comment, add the score to the accumulator. Now, let me tell you how this guy works. It's best to try to look at my mouse here. So the total equals the current value of total, which is actually 0, plus that score. So total equals the current value of total plus score. Well, if the current value of total is 0 and the score is 60, then total would have 60 in it. Okay? And so then we go back up. We're still in this loop right here because remember we were in 0. Now internally it increments to the next value. So now test num would have the value 1, and 1 is still less than 2. So we drop back in the loop, and now it says print test number. And remember, test num is 1. So if we add 1 to it, it would say 2. So test number 2. Okay. And now it's prompting for this for the value to be entered in the score on line 19. And so what we do here is we entered that value. I think we entered 70. And so the string 70 retrieved from the input function would now be passed over to the float function. It converts it into a floating point number. And then this value is stored in the score variable. Okay. And now we drop back down to line 21. So total equals the current value of total, which would have been 60, plus the value in score, which is 70. And so that would actually be, if you add 60 and 70, that's going to be 130. So total would now have 130 as the value. And so now what it's going to do, it's going to kick back up. It's going to, that would make that value 2, and 2 is not less than 2, and so it's going to drop out of that loop. And so now we're going to calculate. So total, which in our example on the first one would be 130 divided by the number of test scores, which is 2, and that's going to be 65 when you do the math, and that would be stored in the average variable. Okay, and so then the next line, the average for student number, and then that would be student plus 1. And remember, so far we're still on the first one. So that's 0 for student. So 0 plus 1 is 1. The average for student number 1 and is going to be, and now you're just formatting, you're using the format function. You're taking the average, which is 65, and you're going to format that to 1 decimal value. Okay, 1 decimal place value. And so that would be 65.0. Okay. And so then after that, the print function does nothing here. Uh, and so we're going to kick up, back up, and now student would be iterated to 1, and then it would check that condition. It is 1 less than 3? Yes, it is. And so it drops back in, and then the whole process is started over until you get all of the information for student 2. And then it kicks back up. It adds 1 more to student, and it checks to see if the condition is true. And remember, it's checking to see if it's less than the current. So we started off with 0. The next value would be 1. 1 is less than 3. The next value would be 2. 2 is less than 3. The next value would be 3. 3 is not less. And so that way it would display student 1, student 2, and student 3. Okay? And so that's how this program works. And so I hope you get something out of this. I'm sure you will if you look at it. So take care, and I will talk to you later. Oh, one other thing before I close. Uh, any questions about this video or any video, go ahead and send me a text, and we'll schedule a personal Zoom meeting. Okay, thanks.